Hello. Hey, this is a video. Isn't that wild? Um, so I am starting a YouTube channel. I technically already started it, but it's titled "Oh the Humanity." That's the idea behind it. I want to look at movies and TV shows and video games and all these other things from a perspective that's a little bit more human, because I feel like a lot of the times when people make video essays, they come off a little too well researched, if that makes sense. That feels almost like it's like, how's that a bad thing? It's super well researched, but I think the average person can sometimes get lost when you do a lot of citing of certain books and research essays about why this is good and why this is very interesting actually. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have people that only go off on angry tangents about things they don't like in movies about how this blah, 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 this thing is bad because the character doesn't match the whatever. And I don't think it's very helpful for people actually trying to interact with media. So I don't think this channel is going to solve any issues. I'm not here to be the little savior coming in to change the world with my YouTube channel. I just wanted to talk about things from my perspective, specifically the perspective that hopefully people can relate to a little bit more if they like it. If they don't, that's fine. I'm more doing this for fun, not because I'm have any aspirations of being a film YouTuber of any kind. So hopefully this works out well. So yeah, let's get started. My first video that I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about Avatar the Last Airbender because I am a very big fan of Avatar the Last Airbender. It's one of my favorite shows, if not my favorite. I've been a fan since I was little. I grew up with it. I have the original show. I have freaking all the comics. I watched Legend of Korra. I'm not as big a fan of it, but we'll get into that maybe another video. I even got my little Abba shirt on right now because theming in the video is cool. And specifically, though, I want to talk about the characters in Avatar because I think the characters are probably one of the most strongest elements in the show. Like, obviously, there's incredible world building, cinematic animation, there's a lot of great emotional beats and memorable humor and the music, and I can go on and on about the things that work about this show. But I wanted to talk about the characters because I think character is a very essential aspect of storytelling. I think it's how most people get engaged with the story. You can have a really intricate, plot heavy, crazy story, but if the characters aren't interesting, it's kind of hard to really care about what's happening. It's like, okay, just things are happening, especially with fantasy when you have elements like magic or any sort of even in sci-fi, like things that aren't real or aren't tangible for us. Characters oftentimes allow us to connect to the story a little bit easier. And so I wanted to talk about the characters of Avatar and how they allow us to connect to the world through their humanity, both the heroes and the villains. For the first video, of course, I wanted to talk about Aang because, he is both the Avatar and the Last Airbender. So obviously it seemed like a very, very strong starting point for the most part. For anyone who hasn't seen the show or for whatever reason just forgot, Aang is a happy-go-lucky 112-year-old kid who has the incredible gift and burden of being the Avatar. In addition to being able to bend all four elements and communicate with spirits, Aang also has the responsibility as Avatar to bring balance to the world. Now, in the context of the show, that means stopping the Fire Nation from conquering all of it. What results from this premise is a fascinating character that I think can be broken down into a few key concepts. In case you don't know, I'm if you can see the blue reflection in my glasses, that's the screen. I'm reading a little bit off a script because, well, I do want this to have a loose kind of feel. At the same time, I also want it to be I want to remember what I'm talking about and not go on some sort of tangent for hours on end that I completely lose focus of what I was talking about, which I am prone to doing. So, for the first chapter, we're going to be talking about the idea of a gifted child. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of the gifted program. Maybe it went by a different title in your school, but it was a program that tested certain children with high grades to see if they were gifted. Basically, if they passed the test, they would get into the gifted program and they'd be given access to resources and certain teachers and aides that would help them excel within their own academic career. I personally was a gifted student, I know, right? But let me tell you, it's a horrible idea. As many people have pointed out, I think especially lately on social media, a lot of people who were entered into the gifted program were sort of given this false pretense that they don't have to try. That was definitely my experience, and I saw a lot of other people acknowledging it too, where basically you'd enter this system where it's like, I'm so good that I just, who cares about studying? Who cares about even like looking into this material? I'm gifted. And then once you get to anything that's slightly challenging, you completely collapse because you don't know how to deal with it. And I think it relates a lot to Aang because he basically is the embodiment of a gifted child. A lot of times in kids shows and movies, the protagonists are specifically made to be younger in order so that they have an easier time relating to them. And a lot of times this kind of rings hollow, especially with dozens of awful YA novels that use nothing with the fact that their characters are children and instead just have them do adult things and act like adults. But Avatar, however, uses this to its full advantage. And I do want to talk about this more with other characters, but for Aang specifically, I think there's one key detail that makes it work so well. Aang was told he was the Avatar when he was 12 years old, as opposed to when he was 16, pretty much the day that every other Avatar has been told. This is first told to us in Book 1, Episode 12 of The Storm, which is considered by most to be one of, if not the best episodes of Season 1. A lot of people cite it as sort of where the show actually got kicked into high gear. When the Air Nomads tell Aang that he's the Avatar, I think there's this interesting little detail that starts this shift in Aang's perception of what being the Avatar means. It's when he's referred to as the young Avatar by one of the monks instead of Aang. Later, when Aang is with Gyatso, Aang's guardian and surrogate father figure, another monk talks about him like he's not even there. He says, "You're playing games with him? The Avatar should be in training." This disassociation between him, who he is as a person, and what he represents is on full display here, and I think it can be felt by many people, specifically many children in the real world. While the gifted program is the strongest example, there's also just being an honor student or having a high GPA or even IQ test to a certain extent. Titles and numbers that break down your worth into how you benefit others, not who you are as an individual. I definitely know that it can definitely hurt your ability to understand what other kids are going through and to relate to them. This idea of like, oh, I am above it all, or I am the gifted kid, not, just a person trying to go through school. And I think the reasoning behind that is shown within the show. Gyatso says that he just wants what's best for the boy, but what they say is what we need is what's best for the world. But the irony of this, obviously, is that by ignoring Aang's personality and his childhood, they kind of doomed the world. It's the decision to separate Aang and Gyatso that caused Aang to run away in the first place. And when the Air Nomads are wiped out, he wasn't there to help them or protect them. Now, obviously, it's not exactly clear if whether or not the Fire Nation would have wiped him out if he had shown up. Maybe he would have entered the Avatar state. Maybe the Air Nomads would still be alive. Who knows? It's not really important. The point is that by saying we're going to separate you and Aang to Gyatso, it did ultimately lead to the doom of the Air Nomads. I think for a lot of kids, too, who have dealt with the pressures of being talented or gifted, also sort of result in having a lack in sort of passion. I know that especially when you're kind of pushed into this sort of like, yes, you are smart, you must like certain things, it kind of pushes you away from it. For me, especially by the time I entered high school, I used to be like great at math and I was into math, and then I just kind of gave up. And as a result, I had to be put into a less advanced class, which was awful because I was better than everyone else in the class. Not to say like, oh, look at me, I'm better. More of just to point out that it's like, I cared so little that the consequences for it were that I was literally being held back, the opposite of what the intent was. It was only when I was able to focus on things that I actually was passionate about that my grades did begin to rise, when I actually started focusing on things like art history, focusing on things like geography, things that I found interesting, culture and stories, that I ended up getting a lot higher grades overall and actually seemed like the gifted kid that they say they wanted me to be. But I don't know many people that have gotten lucky enough to actually feel encouraged into going down that path. I know for sure my mom definitely always focused on like, hey, you should always focus on being happy. But for a lot of kids, if they don't get good grades, that's basically the end all be all of any discussion they have with their parents is like, stop in doing this, stop going and playing with your friends or going and playing video games or investing in things that you maybe want to enjoy as a kid, because the only important thing is your future, is being at the top of your class, even if as a result it means that you're not trying very hard or that you just give up. You do what Aang does, and you run away. That pressure of being the Avatar is shaped extremely into Aang's journey, especially throughout Season 1. We see it on display when one village is being attacked by Heibai, and everyone immediately assumes that Aang just knows how to stop the spirits just because, he's the Avatar. Or even when Katara flips out at him for immediately being great at waterbending, she literally says to him, "Believe it or not, your infinite wisdom gets a little old sometimes. Why don't we all just throw the scroll away since you're naturally so gifted?" literally, it's in the script. I don't know what you want me to say. But this pressure is just seen in the show as a whole. As we go into season 2, it presents itself through Aang's responsibility to let go of the things that he cares about most. Which, of course, is a segue into part 2. Detachment is a somewhat of a controversial concept in terms of enlightenment and character growth in fiction. The concept of detaching yourself from the physical world is one that mainly stems from Buddhist beliefs. And so it would make sense that this has a high influence on Aang's story since the air nomads are primarily inspired by Buddhist monks. We can see this concept play out in other stories as well, a good example being Star Wars. Yoda, the all-around wise Jedi, tells both Luke and his father Anakin that they need to let go of their physical attachments. On Revenge of the Sith, he literally says, "Mourn them do not, miss them do not. You must learn to let go of all that you fear to lose." In both scenarios, our protagonists refuse to give up on the people they care about, and they suffer as a result. In Anakin's case, he becomes Vader, and in Luke's case, he loses his hand. But in both of those scenarios, both in Star Wars and the Avatar universe, we're left to question whether or not this advice is perfectly sound. Avatar's version of Yoda in this instance is Guru Patik, who helps train Aang to master the Avatar state in Book 2, Episode 19, The Guru. To do this, he must unclear all of his chakras, but to open the final chakra, he has to let go of Katara, his best friend and the girl he loves. He refuses to do so and leaves to save her from Azula and Ba Sing Se, but as he does so, Patik warns him that by choosing attachment, you have locked the chakra. If you leave now, you won't be able to go into the Avatar state at all. In the next episode, as Aang faces off against both Azula and Zuko, he locks himself away in a structure of crystals and meditates. He makes the decision to listen to Patik and gives up on Katara, and as a result unlocks the Avatar state. But mere seconds later, he's struck down, and it's implied that he's nearly, if not literally, killed by Azula. Katara manages to get him out of there and heals/resurrects him with spirit water, but his connection to the Avatar state is severed. Ultimately, the decision to detach himself still led to a poor outcome. Similarly, in Star Wars, despite being warned against attachment, it's the bond between Luke and Anakin as father and son that saves them both, despite Yoda and Obi-Wan's insistence that trying to save Vader was pointless. So, is detachment a bad thing? Honestly, it's really hard to say, and I think that's what makes this scenario and this aspect of Aang's character work. There have always been conflicting Western and Eastern ideologies on possession, especially in America, we're extremely possessive of physical items. While the sharing of these two conflicting viewpoints has been around for decades, we can see an example of how they've captured a significant portion of the country fairly recently, as recently as a couple years ago with the show Tidying Up with Marie Kondo, if y'all remember that one. Obviously, the show's host pushed this concept that if something doesn't spark joy when you look at it, then it isn't worth keeping. A lot of people literally half-jokingly applied it to people around you. It's like, oh, when you look at someone, do they spark joy? No? Maybe cut them out of their life. They're toxic. And even other things too, like your job. Like, if my job isn't making me happy, is it worth going to work every day? This sort of thinking doesn't necessarily capture or necessarily even meant to represent the full-on detachment ideology that Buddhists have. But it's more of a hybrid between that extreme and the more Western capitalistic extreme, where we're literally so concerned about physical objects and their value and their worth that they become revered and highly valued as a result. This blend of ideologies can be viewed as a perfect part of Aang's character and in a lot of ways his biggest strength. Aang cares about people, and his refusal to let go of that aspect of himself is in a lot of ways a great way for the audience to sort of feel relieved that they don't have to make the same kind of sacrifices that even someone who has the weight of the world on his shoulders feels like he has to. Aang does beat the Fire Lord without sacrificing the things he loves or his attachments, and even without the Avatar state, he still is able to take him down for the most part. Obviously, it does help, but in a lot of ways, the Avatar state almost was seen as the kind of thing that would give up exactly who he was, sacrifice Aang in favor of the Avatar. And this isn't the first time that idea comes up. In fact, it's teased almost throughout the entirety of Season 2. By the first episode, we literally watch as when Katara's life is threatened, the Avatar state nearly causes him to hurt a lot of innocent people. And even when the Sandbenders steal Appa, and even after they find out that most of them weren't responsible, there was a good point where he was actually planning on hurting and possibly even killing those people. An idea that scares Aang throughout the entire way. So ultimately, there isn't really an easy answer to the questions like this, and a lot of people can tell you otherwise. They can tell you that, no, this is definitely the way to live your life. This isn't the way to live your life. But I feel like it's not very realistic. And I'm glad that the show does a good job of representing that. That, yes, there are certain beliefs that do prosper for certain people. Guru Patik, for instance, seems perfectly content living his life of full detachment. And that's good. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with his life. He seems like he's done his job. And Aang ultimately was successful due to a lot of the advice he learned from Patik. But in general, it is nice that Aang doesn't have to follow him to a T, that he can make his own decisions, even with all of the pressure of the world around him. And also, real quick, before I move on, I just want to talk about Zahir in Legend of Korra. If you haven't seen the show, he's the villain of Season 3, and he's a great villain because he's actually also an airbender. There's this whole plot point with like new airbenders, but he, before he got his airbending, was actually a follower of the airbending philosophy of detachment, to the point that he's the only airbender in the entire series to be able to have the ability to fly, because he commits himself so heavily to the idea of detachment that he literally physically becomes detached from the material world. I think it's a nice way of showing how this idea is like blended into this like gray ideology where it's like, is he really a bad guy? Because he's not really, while he's trying to do bad things, ultimately he is pushing for a new social change, and how these ideas of detachment can be both good or bad. And I would love to make a whole video about him and the Red Lotus overall, because I think they're like the best thing to come out of Legend of Korra. So we'll see. Maybe I'll do that in the future. But for now, let's go to the third and final part. If there's one thing that Aang definitely has to grapple with in terms of being the Avatar, it's his own identity. Being one of this everlasting line of previous avatars can definitely be overwhelming, and we can see how the decisions that they made affect both how Aang sees himself and how he sees the world around him. Roku's decision to spare Fire Lord Sozin started the 100-Year War, and both him and Aang have to grapple with the responsibilities of that left to Aang as a result. He specifically says, "If anyone is to blame for the state of the world, it is me. I should have seen this war coming and prevented it. You inherited my problems and my mistakes." There's nothing easy about having to deal with problems that you had no help in creating, but it's something kind of every generation is forced to deal with. I mean, it's literally what the song "We Didn't Start the Fire" is about, and it came out over 30 years ago. Who didn't start the fire now? But especially now that Gen Z has to deal with climate change, decades of civil rights violations, half-assed infrastructure, the list goes on and on and on of all the issues that have been compounding over years and years, and that we just have to somehow fix them despite having no involvement with how it started. Aside from that being in general overwhelming, there's a huge risk that in trying to solve one problem, we end up losing what motivated us in the first place. Throughout all of Season 3, Aang is told by everyone that it's his duty to kill the Fire Lord, yet Aang is a pacifist by nature, and it's that's helped him make so many allies and resolve so many conflicts along the way. But as we approach the finale, Zuko is finally forced to ask him, "What are you going to do when you face my father?" To answer this question, Aang tries to look for advice from his past lives, and all of them kind of encourage murder. What I found most interesting, though, is that if you actually look at the specific lines that they give, the actual advice that they give, they don't actually contradict Aang's final decision as much as they seem to be leaning towards a straight up just kill him argument. If you listen to what they say, Roku says, "I offer you this wisdom, Aang. You must be decisive." Kyoshi says only justice will bring peace. Kuruk says you must actively shape your own destiny and the destiny of the world around you. And Yang Chen says, selfless duty calls you to sacrifice your own spiritual needs and do whatever it takes to protect the world. At first, it seems like yes, they are all encouraging Aang to just kill the Fire Lord, and honestly, they probably are, especially Kyoshi. But if you look at Aang's final decision to try and take his bending, you see that he's kind of listening to all of them. He's decisive in that he actively decides to risk it all and commit to his beliefs that he should not take a life. He brings justice to bring peace because, I mean, let's face it, Ozai's punishment of not being able to bend when his whole ideology revolves around him being superior due to his firebending is a pretty fitting punishment, I'd say, for the crime. He shapes his own destiny and the world's by proving that violence doesn't have to be the answer, and he does come close to sacrificing his own spiritual needs, putting both his bending and the entire Avatar cycle at risk for the sake of protecting the world from another cycle of revenge and violence. We are often told we must learn from history or else we are doomed to repeat it, but it's important to note that history never contains one lesson. Anyone can frame any event to fit their own values and arguments, and we see that happen every single day. The truth is, you can respect history and past figures without being them. Aang may be the Avatar, but he's his own person. He may embody the powers and beliefs of all of his past lives, but he is not a hive mind, he's his own man. Just like we are all capable of having our own beliefs while still honoring those who came before us, I truly think that this is what makes Aang such a great character. And I think that's also what makes him the perfect lead for a show like Avatar the Last Airbender. So yeah, that's what I love about Aang. And like I said, I plan on making more videos on the characters of Avatar in the future, so feel free to let me know down in the comments who you want to see next. Right now I'm thinking either I'm going to do Zuko or Katara. I know there's probably over a dozen videos on Zuko, so I am leaning more towards Katara purely because I think that at times she's kind of overlooked. But in any case, I will hopefully see you guys in the next video. And for anyone who is curious, yes, I am hopefully going to edit the other watch parties for the Snyder Cut. But for Mortal Kombat, maybe not so much, because kind of the whole time all we did was just joke about how great Kano was. But those will hopefully be out. You know, life is chaotic and we'll eventually find a way. This channel is definitely more of just a do it for fun kind of thing. So if that doesn't happen, sorry, I guess. Maybe if it picks up traction, I'll put more effort into it. But for now, I'm just kind of doing this for me. So great to see. Great to be here. Great to have, yeah, YouTube.